the ACA, the National HIV AIDS Strategy, new biomedical approaches for the prevention of HIV, plus shrinking funding streams have been identified by many as the main contributors for some of the transformation occurring in the sector. The good news, the ACA has become one of the most important pieces of legislation in our lifetime. It has brought health care to millions who would otherwise go without. And coupled with the National HIV/AIDS strategy, we now have a clear plan to end the HIV epidemic. Very exciting times. The disturbing news, though, are that CBOs who from the beginning of the epidemic have led the way and who have been identified by many as being necessary and a critical partner to end the HIV epidemic are collapsing from the pressures I mentioned above. The leaders that I speak to talk about how to implement really talk about how to implement the opportunities presented by the ACA, such as the clinics, 340B pharmacies, billing systems, and electronic medical records to move their organizations forward. And they also talk to me about how the sector transformation is impacting the culture of the organizations they lead. And that is why this webinar. As a former executive director, I am way too familiar with the pain you are feeling. So how do busy leaders impacted by this level of transformational change seize the opportunities within the current environment while keeping their organization stable? It's not simple, but I feel strongly that the answers are in the domain of change leadership. So let's get started. I want to hand this presentation back over to Bob so he can bring us through some great new perspectives and some new tools. And I hope you find the information we are sharing today helpful. If so, Bob and I are going to offer you to do a deeper dive to sort out your next steps to lead your organization forward. So thanks so much for joining us. And Bob?
Okay, Bill, thank you very much. You can hear me all right? Bill, just checking, you can hear me?
Absolutely, yep.
Okay, cool. Well, thank you, Bill.
Perfect.
And I want to welcome and thank all of you for joining us on the webinar. And also thank you, Bill, for creating that context for why we're doing the webinar. Bill and I have been working together for about a year now. And right from the start of our partnership, Bill hooked up with me on LinkedIn, one of the beauties of LinkedIn. And we've been working together for a year. And right from the beginning, Bill conveyed to me how committed he was to helping people like yourselves, organizations in the HIV/AIDS sector, to become empowered to have the kind of impact they should and need to be having to really make a difference. And our partnership's based on that shared commitment to helping leaders like yourselves develop your capacity to lead change. Now, just to give you a little background, my first encounter with Growth River was in my role as the CEO of an educational nonprofit. And I was at the time leading the organization through some very major and disruptive changes, maybe some of the types of changes that all of you are facing. And we were having to restructure the organization from top to bottom, working very hard to move from survival mode to becoming a healthy, thriving organization. And that was both from a mission and financial perspective. Now, during this journey, I had the good fortune of meeting Richard Hawks, the founder and CEO of Growth River, who worked with me and my leadership team for several months. And I can say to you unequivocally that the perspective and methodologies that Richard introduced us to fundamentally changed how I worked as a leader. The holistic framework he provided us for assessing where our organization was and where we needed to go, and then being able to precisely identify the priority issues we needed to focus on to move forward was invaluable. And I have to tell you, as a trained ecologist, to me, the most powerful dimension of the work that I did with Richard was having that framework, which I'm going to introduce you to today. But as a leader, to have a framework through which you can look at your organization, step back and see your organization in a very holistic, integrated way, to me was absolutely invaluable. And I literally went from feeling overwhelmed by the complexity of all the issues we were dealing with to really having a sense of clarity and focus that gave me the confidence and authority that I needed to be an effective leader. So that being said, our goal today is for all of you on the webinar to at least taste the possibility of experiencing that same sense of empowerment. So we have 4 goals for what we want you to take away from this webinar. First, we want to give you an understanding of what's involved in leading transformational change. Second, we want to provide you with an integrated framework that you can use for creating a high-performance team that has the capacity to lead your organization through transformational change. And then we want you to have the experience of some key change leadership competencies that you can begin to put to practice in your organizations right away. And we want you to experience a degree of clarity and focus about the current state of your organization and some priority issues that you need to focus on to move your organization forward. Now, the first thing we need to do is talk about what transformational change really is and what it takes to lead transformational change. Now, in the world of organizations, you can talk about 3 different types of change. We have developmental changes, and these are changes where you're simply improving on what you already have. For example, streamlining existing procedures and processes to make them more efficient. And then we have transitional changes, which are a little bit more complex. This is where you're replacing an old way of operating or an old system with something entirely new. For example, transitioning from an old IT system to a new IT system. Now, granted, both of these types of changes can be challenging, but they do have clear endpoints. They have a clear path for getting from A to Z, and they can be managed as projects. Transformational change, on the other hand, is of a whole different order. And some of the key characteristics of transformational change that make it so challenging are that the future state is unknown. It only emerges as you move forward step by step, and the path and the endpoint are uncertain. It also demands that people change the way they see things and how they behave and how they work together. That can be very challenging for people. And it may require structural or organizational changes. As I mentioned, the organization I was leading had to restructure from top to bottom, including creating a whole new board of directors and training that board of directors. It was a lot of work. And then a very key factor in transformational change is it requires a critical mass of people who embrace the changes. You need a minimum coalition of team members who not only have bought into the case for change, but they feel accountable for driving that change. This can be a lot of the hard work at the beginning, is creating that minimum coalition, whatever it is, your senior leader team, whatever that minimum coalition people is for people who are on board with why you need to go through this kind of change and then are willing to take responsibility for helping you drive that change. And then critical in the context of what we're going to be learning today, transformational change needs to be led, not managed. And to lead transformational change, you need to be able to align culture, structure, strategies, and implementation simultaneously. And these are not insignificant points. IBM, I don't know if you're familiar with the study that IBM did of over 1,500 organizations globally, and they found that 70% of change initiatives fail to meet the project objectives of time, cost, and quality. And shockingly, only 20% of the organizations surveyed could be considered to be competent at leading change. Note that last point. Most of us are not very good at leading change. And this is why it's our belief, and Bill has gotten religion about this over the last year. It's our belief that change leadership is one of, if not the most critical leadership capability for you to be mastering at this time of rapid change. And that will be the focus of what we're presenting in the webinar today, providing you with an introduction to some of the capabilities you need to master to be able to effectively lead change. So now I want to introduce you to what we call the 7 critical conversations. the framework that's the basis of what we call our growth river operating system. Now, you may ask, why do we call them conversations? And the simple answer I like to give people is this is the stuff you and your team need to be talking about. These 7 critical conversations encompass all of the critical domains of an organization that I mentioned a few moments ago: culture, structure, strategy, and implementation. And it's our conviction that organizations change, teams develop, and businesses grow at the speed at which these critical conversations can be resolved and meaningful actions taken. Change leadership, in our view, is essentially the capacity to do that. So how do you use the 7 critical conversations? Well, one way for using it is as a framework for driving structured, note the word emphasis on structured, conversations in which you look through the lens of each of the 7 critical conversations to assess the current state of your organization, to determine what the ideal future state would look like, and then to identify the gaps between where you are and where you would like to be. You can then use this information to determine what the priority issues are that you need to resolve to move to the next higher level of performance. And then you can define change initiatives and action plans for resolving those issues. So this is one of the most powerful uses for the 7 critical conversations, is to carry out a gap analysis on your organization using the lenses of each of these 7 conversations. Another very powerful way for using the 7 critical conversations is to identify what we call the primary constraint to change. And this is a very important concept that I want you to walk away with today. Primary constraint to change is the one issue that is the biggest impediment to your team being able to move to the next higher level of performance. And it's the one issue that needs to be addressed first for you to be able to move forward. And resolving this constraint will always yield the highest return for your investments in time and resources. And obviously, in a resource-constrained organization, like many of you may be leading, focusing your resources on those efforts that are going to yield the most return is very important. And we get asked that question by leaders all the time. How do I sort out from all that what seem like many priority issues, how do we sort out the ones that are most important? And that's what today's webinar is designed to help you do. So you simply ask, in which of the 7 critical conversations does your primary constraint to leading change lie? And then ask, well, what's the root cause? As an example, you may determine that the primary constraint is in mindset, and that the root cause for that constraint is that the leadership culture is risk averse. And then this little diagram to the right illustrates how, when you resolve a primary constraint to change, you jump to a higher level of performance and then typically plateau until you resolve the next constraint that emerges. So you can see that developing a high performance team is a process of continually using the 7 critical conversations to identify and resolve primary constraints to change. So now I'd like you to have the experience of actually using the 7 critical conversations yourself. Now, how am I going to do this? Well, it starts with asking the right questions, and we'll be doing exactly that in just a moment. I'm going to walk you through each of these 7 conversations, and as I do that, I'll pose some questions that I'd like you to consider. How would you answer each of these questions as I take you through the 7 conversations? And in fact, I would suggest that you scribble down short answers, a word or two, for each one as you go through them. Doing this will begin to give you the experience of working with the 7 conversations, and ideally, a start towards getting some clarity about your organization. Now, bear in mind, in the context of a webinar, we can only give you the experience of a very quick test drive of these conversations and how to use them, but hopefully enough for you to see the potential for this framework to provide you with some clarity and focus. And as Bill mentioned at the end of the webinar, we'll be offering you an opportunity for having a more in-depth conversation. Now, as we go through the 7 conversations, please hold the following 3 overarching questions in mind And I'll repeat them again, once again, when we've gotten through all 7 of the conversations. Number 1, what attributes stand out as being issues that need to be addressed on your team? Secondly, what one attribute is currently your primary constraint to change? And third, what do you envision as a solution path for resolving this constraint? So just begin to have some ideas of what it would take to resolve that constraint. So again, the whole point here is just to give you a feel for what it would be like for you and your team to be having these conversations and asking these kinds of questions. And I also would like you to imagine what your world might look like if your team was optimized in each of the competencies that are implicit in the questions I'll be posing. For example, would you experience more clarity about where you are, where you want to be, and where the gaps are? And more focus in relationship to what the priority issues are that you need to address to move forward. So let's get started. We'll begin with the first of the 7 conversations, purpose. The first question to ask is, are your vision, mission, and purpose clear and compelling? Now, let me say a little bit about what we mean by purpose. I'll assume that vision and mission statements are familiar to all of you. However, purpose statements, and more specifically, what we call operational purpose statements, may be a new concept to you. So simply put, operational purpose statements help you clarify the key activities and roles that are actually required to serve your current and future customers. So the operational purpose statement is more customer facing. And they help each and every team member have a clear understanding of how their day-to-day activities that they're responsible for directly impact your customers or clients. Now, I'm not going to go into it any more than that, only to say it is an important concept. And I would suggest you take a look at a series of 3 videos that we produced on how to write vision, mission, and purpose statements. You can find those on our blog page on our website. If you go to www.growthriver.com and click on the blog link up at the top, you'll see links to all of these videos. So I recommend you take a look at them. Now, the next question to ask is, are your team members aligned with and motivated by your vision, mission, and purpose? I was recently speaking to a leader that I've been working with for the last 3 or 4 years, and he told me that he feels, although everyone is on his team is clear about the mission of the organization. I asked him the question, is everybody clear about your vision and mission? He said, yeah, they're clear about it, but not everyone is authentically motivated by the mission, and that he can see this showing up in their day-to-day attitude towards their work. So it's an important question. And now we're going to move to focus. Here we ask, how clear is your team about the current state of your organization? What would your ideal future state look like in reference to each of these 7 critical conversations? And where are the gaps between where you are and where you want to be? And then, as I said earlier, answering these questions enables you to get very clear about the priority issues you need to focus your attention and resources on to close those gaps. And it was interesting, we did an analysis with a client that we've been working with for over a year. We did an analysis with one of their sub-teams, and it turned out one of their primary constraints was focus. They were not on the same page with what they thought the current state of the organization was, what the desired future state, and what the priority issues were. And you can imagine if the team's not on the same page with regards to these kinds of questions, it's going to be very difficult for the team to align around a clear path forward. So that was the first order of business, is we had to get on the same page with what the issues were. And now we're going to move to mindset. Now, there's lots in the literature about what mindset is, but for our purposes here, let's keep it simple, and let's simply define it as the beliefs and attitudes we hold both as individuals and collectively that impact how we behave. I think we all know how our various mindsets can impact how we see and react to the world around us. In this next series of questions, gets at the kinds of mindset issues that most teams have to grapple with. We call it the people stuff, and that many teams avoid facing. Often, and this is another interesting point, often teams that we work with discover that their primary constraints to change, at least initially, lie in this domain. So what to ask? Ask, do your team members feel accountable for more than just themselves and the roles they're playing? Do they feel accountable for their team members and the whole organization, for example? What's the working atmosphere like amongst your team members? Are people open and candid based on trust and respect? And then a very important competency for any team member committed to higher performance is both the willingness and ability to give and receive feedback from their peers to help everyone become more effective at playing their roles. So ask how you're doing on this front. Most teams we work with are not doing very well at all on this front. Are there stories that are limiting the performance of individuals or perhaps the whole team? Stories that aren't even getting surfaced and spoken about and resolved. And then finally, are team members leading in a way that inspires others? Now let's move on to the fourth conversation, roles. First question to ask, does every key strategy, decision, and activity have a single owner? And does each owner feel accountable for and are held accountable for driving issues in their domain, executing and driving issues in their domain to resolution? And finally, is the flow of activities among roles clear? We often discover with our clients that there are fuzzy lines between roles. For example, certain key activities don't have a clear owner, and therefore things fall between the cracks, or the handoffs between roles are not clear. Now, in this next conversation, interdependencies, we put a huge emphasis on this, and we end up spending a lot of time on this typically. If this is where the work resulting from identifying and resolving issues in the first four of the conversations, purpose, focus, mindset, and roles, can serve as a foundation for creating and developing the interconnections and ways of working together that are really the essence of a high-performance team. Some of the questions to ask: are you very clear about where there is shared work? And are team members collaborating and communicating effectively? Have you defined very clear decision-making hierarchies so that everyone knows who has final call on what decisions? And you need to honestly assess how well is the team doing with respect to resolving conflicts. Many teams that we begin working with are very conflict averse, and they know it, yet they avoid committing as a team to resolving that issue. And finally, do you have clear and effective rules and protocols in place for how team members engage and work together? For example, conflict resolution protocols. That would be one good example. And these kind of rules and protocols are very concrete and tangible ways that your teams can up their game. And now we're going to move to strategies, which is where the rubber hits the road. Some of the key questions to ask here: are leaders advocating for strategies from the perspective of their roles? From our point of view, this is one of the most important responsibilities of any leader, to fully represent and advocate for the perspective of their role, and then to contribute to the broader team conversation around developing the best set of strategies that are going to serve the whole team and organization. This leads to the next question: do team members align in the end around the optimal set of strategies that are best for the whole organization, even if it means they're not getting what they specifically advocated for? And finally, are there clear metrics for tracking and measuring how effectively those strategies are being implemented and what impact they are having? Now, in the last conversation, we need to talk about how effectively people are actually implementing the strategies. Are team members delivering tangible results, the kind of results that build confidence and credibility and trust? And we find that one of the more debilitating situations we see in organizations, something you may be familiar with, is where there's a lot of talk, lots of strategies and action plans in place, but consistent failure to deliver trust. And we know how that experience creates cynicism and undermines trust across a team if people are not coming through with the goods. Ask how effectively team members are communicating clear and compelling ways forward for others. And is the team working together as one team to manage all the key activities, resources, time, and risk so things don't fall through the cracks and not get attended to? Okay, so that's it. We've been through the 7 critical conversations. And granted, that was, as I mentioned, it's going to be a kind of a drive-by experience of the 7 critical conversations, but hopefully you found that valuable. And what I want to do now is revisit those 3 questions I posed at the beginning. Asking again, what attributes stand out as being issues that need to be addressed on your team? What one attribute is the primary constraint to change for your team? And what do you envision as a solution path for resolving this constraint? And now, based on that very brief run through of the 7 critical conversations and the idea of there being one primary constraint to change, we'd like to do a little survey. So we'd like to ask you, in which of the 7 critical conversations is your primary constraint to change, and what is the root cause? So what we'd like you to do is for each of you to type your primary constraint and then the root cause in a few words into the question box at the bottom of the control panel on the right side of your screen. For example, maybe your constraint's in mindset and the root cause is that the leader of the organization is conflict averse. So why don't you go ahead and do that now? And Bill, I was thinking while we're waiting for the results of the survey to come in, I actually would like to ask you, in your experience working with directors and other leaders in the HIV sector, what have you found to be some of the common issues that they're having to deal with?
Okay, well, good. Let me think about that for a moment. Here's one that just came up. Let me set the stage on this. Few leaders we've had conversations. They've completed a strategic plan. They're fully implemented in their process. They've done a really good job on strategic planning. They did some research, and the staff have been involved, and they agreed, and national colleagues agreed that moving forward a medical model is critical for them to stay alive. Some of these leaders have launched 340B pharmacies, looked into collaborating with local clinics. But what they have found is interesting, that the case managers seem to be resistant to growth. Even though they were in on the strategic planning process, there seems to be a disconnection. And clearly, as a former ED and these EDs that I've been talking to, that case managers are critical for them to move forward. And so how do they align them? So after a few more questions, first they agree that their strategic plan reflects a huge shift in their organization. Next, I usually ask, since you've been in the implementation phase, have you sat down with your case management staff to discuss any concerns, such as limiting mindsets, any fears or loyalty issues, concerns about a shift in roles with clients? Or have you just assumed that because they participated in a strategic planning process and agreed with your new direction that they are on board? Usually, Bob, about that time, the light bulb goes off. And after further investigation, other solutions that may show up through the 7 critical conversations, what I love about the 7 critical conversations is that they allow for a dynamic interchange of awareness and ideas to create the conditions for change. Bob, I guess I'm a geek for change as well as driving change forward successfully. It does take tools, as you were just discussing, to lead to solutions. At least for me, I resonate with the solutions found as a result of using the 7 critical conversations. So here's a couple one. Well,
thank you, Bill. But first of all, I'll just say thank you to that. And it made the whole little story you just told makes a lot of sense, because I think it drives home one of our prime directives for the work we do. You've got to create that high performance team first, right, or at least in parallel with all the other issues you're dealing with.
Uh-huh.
Otherwise, you're just going to fall flat on your face. So you have to
Yeah,
invest a lot in creating that high performance team.
absolutely. So
Yeah.
here's one from, let's say, from Michigan, Bob. The mindset staff does not like to change.
Yes.
And so there's two comments here. Teams push back
Yeah.
against strategic direction pushed by the CEO. Also, they are challenging getting new stuff done as we're so busy putting out fires.
Yeah.
So
That's
talk to me
classic.
about that, Bob.
That's classic. Yeah, but what I would say to that, to whoever typed that in, I mean, look, as Bill said earlier, I feel your pain. I went through the same thing myself when I was leading that organization. Both those issues, people resistant to change and people feeling like they're spending their life putting out fires and there was no time for doing this kind of work. But I would say it again. I think, first of all, the whole idea of building a minimum coalition, I mean, that was the key in my situation where I started off literally with, I think, four of us total, five of us total, who were completely immersed in driving this kind of change in the organization. And we
Mm-hmm.
worked with a consultant. It was before we actually worked with Grover. We worked with a consultant to develop our skills as leaders. And we created that minimum coalition. And then slowly but surely, we were able to mobilize more and more people in the organization. Not easy, but if you don't have that minimum coalition, you're on your own, and it's going to be very challenging.
Mm-hmm.
And then yeah, so I'll leave it at that. But
Okay, cool. Hey, do we have time for two more?
sure, sure.
All right. I've experienced resistance by long-term employees who act like they're I can't read the rest of it here. Um, I can't read the rest of it. So, oh, wait a minute. Okay. They are in support of change, but behind the scenes are causing havoc. Interesting.
Ah,
I've experienced resistance by long-term employees who act like they are in support of change, but behind the scene are causing havoc.
yes, very familiar. We have a we have an expression for that, and they may not fit in this expression. We call them toxic rock stars, people who are high performers, and they may not be toxic, but they're high performers, or they may not be high performers. But the toxicity comes in when people are behaving in a way that undermines rather than unifies the team, and that kind of thing, where there are things going on behind the scenes. And the way that we end up dealing with that is we do team alignments, we get people in the room, and then we've done quite a bit of work before we get in the room to hear from each person, where they think that we basically do a gap analysis of sorts with each of the people one on one before we get in the room. And then we surface these kind of issues, but we do it in the room with everybody present, which depersonalizes the whole process, number one. And it enables people to actually look each other in the eye and get very honest about what's actually going on.
Mm-hmm.
And we have had situations in the end where somebody has to, in the end, because of the undermining effect they have on a team, they just don't fit. They have to leave. But we've had many more situations where you're able to turn people around by aligning people in a collective context like that, and then addressing those kind of issues head on. So,
Wow, that's great. So do we have one more? Do you have
sure,
one more?
yeah, no, we're doing
Okay,
we're
time
doing
for
good
one
on
more.
time.
Okay, so interdependencies. My staff is exhausted with so much to do. Sounds like, and people are operating in silos, Bob.
Now there's another one, the silo thing. I was that leader I told you I mentioned when I was speaking about mission. When I started working with that organization, they were completely operating in silos. They
Mm-hmm.
had concrete walls between the different roles and different departments, and is because they had been living in a toxic culture for many years before this new leader came on, and he was a very enlightened leader. The first thing we needed to do was get that out on the table and then start breaking down those silos. And the beautiful thing when we did that is that people learned how to work together. This is where we developed the interdependencies. And then in working together, they suddenly felt it wasn't that still didn't have a lot of challenging issues to deal with, but they were working together on those issues. And you got the magnifier effect of having people, because they're working together, new solutions emerging, people suddenly discovering ways they could be helping each other out. And there was a sense of we're all in it together. So, yes, they were still overwhelmed with how much they had to do, like most nonprofits,
Mm-hmm.
but they were able to work much more effectively and work really as a team to deal with some of this
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah. This is really concerning, Bob, because from the leaders, the conversations that I've had with with leaders in the HIV sector, it's really important that we're all on board to move organizations forward. As I
Exactly.
said earlier, it's so critical that community-based organizations are healthy and could really help us move the goals of the National HIV/AIDS strategy forward. Um, and if folks are interested in a recent article that I just read from Kaiser, let me know in the question and answer box if you'd like me to send you a link. But it really tells the tale that CBOs are very, very important as we move forward.
All right.
So at this point, Baba, I think that's it. We
No,
can
no,
open
no,
it up
that's not
again.
Bill. You're cutting me short here, dude.
Oh, that's right.
I got just a couple more points I wanted to make before we wrap it up. Because I want people to have two really major more points, and it won't take too long. Recall the point I made at the beginning of the webinar when I stated that leading transformational change requires aligning culture, structure, strategies, and implementation simultaneously. Now, this representation of the 7 critical conversations that you're looking at can help you visualize how this works. Notice that the first 5 of the conversations can be thought of as defining culture, while the last 4 you can think of as driving your business models. And then there's that overlap between the 2 domains, which encompass the roles and interdependencies. This is where the alignment of culture and business models happens. It's a critical, this area right in there is critical. And to become a high performing team, one of the main points I want to make is that to become a high performing team, you need to optimize the conditions in each of these 7 critical conversations. And a simple way of stating that is to say, to make success inevitable, to create the conditions that will make success inevitable, you need the right leaders who have the right mindsets, playing the right roles, working interdependently within a complete system of roles, aligning around an effective set of shared strategies, note the emphasis on shared, and implementing effectively to get the right results. So you see, this is a very holistic approach, a holistic, all-encompassing approach to creating a high-performance team and aligning your culture and your business models. And Bill, you mentioned that one of the necessary areas that needs to be addressed in the HIV/AIDS sector is to really deal with the cultural issues head on. It's not enough to just come up with new business models. They're going to help these organizations become more sustainable. You won't successfully be able to implement those business models and get the results you want unless you have a healthy culture and a high performance team.
Very good.
And then one more point. Whoop, I need to go back up. Another characteristic of these 7 critical conversations is that there is a hierarchy to the conversations. And by that, we simply mean that on the journey to high team performance, you need to resolve the constraints from the top down, represented here by that downward pointing arrow. As an example, when assessing your team, you may find they're not creating effective strategies and or successfully implementing those strategies, and thus you're not getting the results you want. You should first take a close look at conversations 1 through 5. Why? Because you may discover that the root cause for why you're not successfully creating and implementing strategies may well lie in one of those 5 conversations. And it's really important to identify where the real constraint is, or you'll end up focusing your effort on resolving the wrong issues. I'll give you an example. A team I worked with recently were convinced that their issues were in strategies and implementation, and that they needed to come up with more effective ways to implement. But then we took a deeper dive in. We discovered very quickly that the constraint was in interdependencies. They just weren't working together effectively which was accounting for why they weren't successfully able to implement their strategies. So how are we doing for time? Bill, I think maybe at this point I was going to tell one more little story, but I think at this point I'll skip that. But I do want to make one last point is not, I want you to go away from this not thinking that it's a linear process to go through these 7 conversations. It's not that you simply move 1 through 7 in a linear kind of way, clockwise going around that circle I was showing you at the beginning, resolving constraints as you go. Just doesn't typically work that way. For example, you may assess your team, discover that the primary constraint to change is in your roles, a lack of a clear and complete system of roles. You need to resolve that issue first and then see what emerges as the next constraint. It may be in interdependencies, but it may not be. Mm-hmm. You just don't know until you do that work. And the other point to make is that the journey doesn't end. You don't just go 1 through 7 and that's the end of the story. You're constantly identifying and resolving constraints to take your team to the next higher level of performance. It's a never-ending journey. So just to wrap up, another way of saying what I just said is if you drive all 7 critical conversations to resolution in the right order, then success becomes inevitable. So what are the key takeaways we want you to walk away with? First of all, an understanding of what's involved in transformational change. You've now been introduced to the 7 critical conversations as a framework that you can use to be having very structured conversations with your team. You can be using it to do a gap analysis, for example, and identifying your primary constraint to change. And finally, addressing culture, the importance of addressing culture, structure, strategy, and implementation simultaneously, and dealing with cultural issues first. It's the famous quote from Peter Drucker, I believe, culture eats strategy. So I think that's it, Bill. I think we can wrap it at that, and we can open it up to questions.
Great. So, Bob, we've already started getting questions. So just to piggyback on your quote, I've got a question here. Do you have time to expound on culture? And then they said, or could that be a topic for another webinar? So, so do you have time? We have time to do that, Bob. Can you?
Yeah, we have a little bit of time. I think it's a very good question. Let's just go back. I'm going to go back to this diagram here. Recall that I said that culture kind of encompasses the first 5 of these critical conversations. So what we often find when we go into an organization, more often than not, they have cultural issues. They have either an ineffective, in some cases, very unhealthy culture. And we do that deeper dive, and we have tools for doing all this. For each of the 7 conversations, we have tools for working on the issues that emerge. But we do a real deep dive. As I mentioned, we do one-on-one interviews with everybody on whatever the team is that we're going to be working with, and we get very clear about where the issues are. And then and a lot of times, the focus has to be for a while on building a healthy culture. In fact, I'll tell you real quickly the story I was going to tell. We were working with a nonprofit down in Florida, and we had done 1 2-day alignment. We were about to head a few months later into our second 2-day alignment. We were going through the agenda with the executive director, and he got very heated. He said, enough of this culture work. He said, I want to spend this 2 days working on strategies. And we pushed back. We said, look, the team is not ready for that. There's still a lot of cultural mindset issues, leadership mindset issues we have to deal with. The system of roles is not clear, and these people are barely beginning to learn what it means to work together. So we held our ground, and he relented in the end. So we did that 2-day meeting, and we dealt with the issues we knew we needed to deal with. And then a couple months later, we were ready to do the strategy work. And we were in the midst of doing that meeting. It was a 2-day meeting. And at one point, one of the leaders lifted their head up and said, I get it. It was an aha moment. She said, I get it. I see why we had to do all that work first before we could work together as a team on designing and implementing strategies. And then the leader, he was very humble. He swallowed his pride and said, you're right. You're exactly right. So you have to hold your ground, but you can't skip doing that kind of work. And in the
Hmm.
end, they were able to work together very effectively, much more effectively. So I don't know if that helps, but there's a lot you could talk a lot about culture, but
Right.
yeah.
Absolutely. Well, let's do a quick shout out to our participant who uh, presented that question to see if we've answered that question for her.
Or
And
offer, you can offer her. Look, we're happy to, have a phone call and talk more about it.
absolutely, absolutely. We'll talk about that a little bit more at
Yeah.
the end. But
Yeah.
here's another question here, Bob. I have a resistant board who creates roadblocks for me uh, to innovate.
Ah, yes.
So the question here is, can I use the 7 critical conversations with my board without sounding accusatory?
Well, that's a good question.
You
I
have to
mean,
be
I
very
think that,
careful with boards.
yeah.
Yeah.
No, I'm with you. I'm with you. I mean, I think a very powerful way for using this, if, let's suppose you've created that minimum coalition of people who really get it. They get why you have to drive forward with some fundamental transformational change, and they're on board with it. And you're using these 7 critical conversations to build a really strong case for change. You can use that case for change. And I did this when I was a CEO. I was most effective. I was also on the board. I was most effective in those board meetings when I had done the hard work of creating a very strong, compelling case for change when I went before the board. Number one, they typically would see the irrefutable logic of what I was presenting, but more importantly, it was transmitted the kind of thought and teamwork that went into creating that case for change, which gave
Hmm.
the board confidence and made them more receptive to what it was that I was presenting, and sometimes brought in some of the other team members. So I think
No, that's great.
just a short answer is you can use the 7 critical conversations to create a compelling case for change, to go armed to the board meeting, to the board of directors with, and
Mm.
push through the resistance.
Here's another question, Bob. We have community planning bodies, and this really is coming from me. So we have community planning bodies out in our communities who help, for example, AIDS directors put together plans to make impact. And those community planning bodies are coming together. For example, prevention and care are coming together.
Yeah,
How could we use the 7 critical conversations to begin to create strategies to end the HIV epidemic at
right.
this stage, and B, how to bring these two entities together in a really effective way?
Oh, that's a really good question. That's a big one. And that's doing a, kind of a, I don't want to say cross sector, but cross organizational or kind of an alignment. I mean, I think typically what we would do in that kind of situation is we'd work ideally with the individual entities first to create alignment within each entity individually, and then do a cross organization with these. Say again what they were. It's the CBOs and
It would be, for example, some states have separate care and treatment sections and separate prevention
right.
sections.
So then,
And our government partners have asked these sections to merge their planning
all right,
bodies together. And some states are in process, some states have already completed this process.
right, right,
But how do we merge? And so, first, how do you merge those bodies? Because sometimes those bodies have conflicts.
right.
And then, two, some of the states are now creating HIV plans with their governor to end HIV. How would you then bring both bodies together to start having that conversation?
Well, I'll give you the short answer would be ideally you would work with those different, as I was saying before, those entities
Mm-hmm.
separately so that they start to understand this framework. They become aligned as a team. They understand the
Mm-hmm.
framework. They understand the workings of creating a compelling case for change and what it takes.
Mm-hmm.
And then you bring the two together and you do an alignment across the 2 or 3 entities, and then they begin to learn how to work together. And there's going to be
Mm-hmm.
a lot. It's challenging because you have different cultures and all
Right.
that. But you do the work,
Absolutely.
especially in the, down the interdependencies, really learning how to work together, deal with mindsets. They might have ideas about each other that are getting in the way,
Mm-hmm.
et cetera, et cetera. So you can use the framework, really, you can use it in just about Any organization, large or small, for-profit, not for-profit, and across organizations and across sectors.
Great. Okay. Well, very good. So let's wrap this up, Bob, because we're at 11:53 now, and I want to get everybody. For those of you who took up your lunch hours, I want to thank you, and I want to get everybody back to their respective to-do lists. So I hope you found this conversation interesting. And if you're interested in having a more in-depth conversation with Bob and I about your organizations, the challenges you are dealing with, how to use what we've learned today to deal with these challenges, we would love to hear from you. Please let us know, and we'll follow up with a call to schedule a further conversation. The last slide shows my name, my email, and my phone number. You can either send me an email to set up an appointment, or you can type into the question box that you would like us to get in touch with you, and we will give you a call and set up an appointment to have a conversation with Bob and I so we can do a deeper dive. That deeper dive would be about a half an hour conversation with both Bob and I, and then we can find out what is next for your process. So again, thank you so much, Bob. Thank you for everybody who participated today. This was a project Bob and I have been working on for probably about 4 to 5 months. It's great to have this completed and accomplished in 2015, and look forward to many more conversations from Bob and I from Growth River. And Bob, I'll let you say the final thoughts, but again, thank you everyone, and happy holidays.
Yes, well, I want to thank everybody who participated. I want to thank you, Bill, because to me, this was a year ago we met on LinkedIn, and then we discovered our shared interests and we created a partnership. So it just speaks to the same kind of thing we've been speaking about throughout, the power of working together. So again, I want to emphasize what Bill said. Please feel free. You can type it in the question box if you want. Just let us know you'd like for us to follow up. We have your email addresses, and we'll make sure to reach out to you and schedule a call. So happy holidays, everyone, and thanks for joining us.
All right. Thanks, Bob.